Christianity in the Middle Ages, or what we call the medieval period, is pretty interesting, and that is what chapter 12 covers. And chapter 12 is called Christianity in the Medieval Mind, dealing with the first 300 years of the second millennia, 1000 to 1300. There's a lot of information in this chapter, so I'm not going to cover everything that is in the slideshow presentation, but I want to single out a few people, kind of the superstars of the era, talk a little bit about them, and a couple of other events that happened in this period, and of course, you want to read the entire chapter. But there is a lot of information packed in here, and not even all of it, which is the other thing. This is just a very small fraction of what really was going on in that first 300 years of the second millennium. But let's talk a little bit about Catholicism, because that, of course, is the dominating religion in Europe at the time. And for some of you, this might be extremely familiar information because you may yourselves be Catholic. I know some people usually identify themselves as Catholic in one way or another, whether they're very practicing or not so much, but either way, you should be familiar with some of this information. You may not know all the history, but of course, in catechism, they do teach you a lot of this information. So, but the seven sacraments, as they're called, existed in the church long before being classified together as sacraments to distinguish them from other church rituals, and long before any discussion of their precise number or what they had in common. The Fourth Lateran Council, which was in 1215, set forth the Western Catholic conception of the seven sacraments. And the breakdown of these sacraments is as follows. There's two of initiation, baptism and confirmation. Then there's the Eucharist, which probably you may have heard of this. In fact, in Protestantism, the two rites, the two things that are carried over from Catholicism are the Eucharist and the baptism. And a lot of churches actually still do confirmation, so in the Protestant movement. But so you've got baptism and confirmation, then you've got the Eucharist, which is the central action supposed constitutive of the church, around which the others are grouped. Commonly we refer to the Eucharist as the Mass or the Divine Liturgy, or among Protestants, Holy Communion or the Lord's Supper. And then there's two of healing, two sacraments of healing, one being that of reconciliation, which is healing of sins, which is your absolution from sin, commonly referred to as confession or penance, when you enter the confession booth and you speak to the Father and you confess your sins, and He absolves those sins. It's a very necessary part of the way Catholicism functions. And then there's the anointing of the sick, which is extreme unction, basically your last rites. When you're dying, you have the priest come in and they declare over you that your sins are absolved, and it's kind of your final last rite of passage into eternity to hopefully ensure you go to heaven. Ordination is another one of the sacraments, conveying authority to celebrate the Eucharist and to teach. Priests must be ordained. It's a very important process in Catholicism. If you lose your ordination, you get fired. You're no longer trusted to celebrate the Mass or handle the host, the Eucharist, and all those ins and outs. You can't do confession. And so ordination is an important part of Catholicism. It's one of the seven sacraments, and marriage is unique to Catholicism because you have to be married in the Catholic Church in order for your marriage to essentially be honored. And so that is very important to Catholics. It's why a lot of times when Catholics and Protestants marry, it's not as much of a big deal to a Protestant as it is to a Catholic, so they might have a Catholic wedding to be married in the Catholic Church, to sort of settle the conscience, so to speak. But in the Middle Ages, clergy had a serious power. I mean, they held this serious power over the people because partaking in the sacraments was essential to belonging to the church. In order to be buried in hallowed ground, you had to engage in the sacraments, and you wanted to be buried with your family in a Catholic cemetery under the authority of the church, because that was another part that ensured, you went into the afterlife. But it was essential; these sacraments are essential to belonging to the church in order to be saved. And so the clergy in the Middle Ages held a serious power over the people. The Pope held a serious power even over the kings. In fact, there's one incident that proves this. In 1076, this is a very interesting story. Some say one of the most dramatic stories of the Middle Ages. And I also saw an article that listed it in the top 10 apologies of all time. But in 1076, the German king Henry IV was excommunicated by Pope St. Gregory II. And in this excommunication, the king himself decides that he should go in person and beg for forgiveness from the Pope. And so he walks for 3 days over the Alps, in the winter, mind you, with snow on the ground, to basically stand at the door, knocking, waiting for the Pope to acknowledge him and receive him. And which he has to receive him, actually, because he was truly penitent. And there's actually a belief in Catholicism that if someone is sincerely seeking absolution or penance, that they cannot be rejected by a clergy member, especially the Pope. And so, Henry IV is throwing himself on the mercy of the Pope, and he receives him and he forgives him, and he lifts the excommunication. But so you would say, why is this so important? What is the point? Well, the reason why that excommunication would be so serious is that it would nullify basically all the sacraments that had previously been done in the kingdom that Henry IV, presided over. And so there would be no extreme unction, no last rites. All the marriages would be annulled in the eyes of the church. So the human souls of the people in the kingdom would be in jeopardy because of the authority of the king. If he was excommunicated, then all the things he'd done in his court for the people would no longer be effective. So that was very problematic. And it just kind of demonstrates the power and the authority that the church had. And really the popes, had more authority than, the kings. And so you see this power structure in the church that was extremely significant at the time. So believing that there was a human soul that would continue on in some kind of existence beyond this temporal existence on earth, a person would either go to heaven or hell or purgatory. Clergy held this exceptional amount of authority and power concerning the destination of people's souls. Now, heaven and hell tend to be pretty clearly understood, I think, amongst most people, but purgatory does need a little bit of explanation for some folks, and so I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about purgatory just briefly. Purgatory is not hell, but it's comparably miserable, except for the fact that a person may be able to, quote-unquote, get out, so to speak. Suffering in purgatory is thus believed to be satisfying some kind of debt that the human soul owes because of their sins. But once that debt is satisfied, a human soul can be released into heaven. So the expiatory nature of the suffering in purgatory, which expiatory just means satisfactory, kind of like a satisfying the wrath of God. Expiatory, the expiatory nature of the suffering in purgatory is confirmed by the conviction that the church militant, which just means the whole body of living Christian believers, so the ones who are still alive in the church on earth, that they can actually pay debts of the church suffering, which are those in purgatory, by offering suffrages, sacrificing the Mass, as well as through indulgences, which was one of the things that the reformer Martin Luther, in a few hundred years from this period we're discussing now, has a major issue with, which was basically where you could pay money to get people out of purgatory. Fellow members of the same mystical body should share and relieve the burden of debt incurred by their errant siblings in the faith. And so that was a common belief in the Middle Ages, that you stand in the gap, so to speak, in this life, and you pray for and you give indulgences in the name of people that are suffering in purgatory. However, it was only by the authority of the clergy that could receive the Mass or receive the indulgences. So again, this placed a great deal of authority in the hands of the church. Another superstar, or first superstar, I guess we'll bring into the discussion today, is that of Hildegard of Bingen. She is a pretty interesting lady, to say the least, which it's always interesting to see when there are famous women throughout history, especially in the Middle Ages, making a tremendous impact because, of course, it was a very patriarchal, male-dominant system, and so for women to ever get a leg up was rare. But Hildegard was born in 1098 in Bermersheim, which was a small town not far from Mainz, which was in Germany. She was the 10th child of a local nobleman named Hildebert and his wife Mechthild. Very German names, but from earliest childhood, she gave these indications of having very unusual faculties, and so she was, in fact, a mystic, is what we would call her. And one thing I wanted to note was that she was given as a tithe, because she was the 10th child. Her family gave her away as a tithe to the church, which is interesting. But so from her earliest childhood, she gave indications of having unusual faculties, seeing, as she herself affirms, brilliant lights and strange visions. In her naivete, she thought that everybody saw the kind of things that she saw, and so one day she asks her nurse if she sees the things that she sees, and she receives a negative response in return, and she didn't really say much else about it. But it was at an early age of 3 or 5 years old that she began experiencing paranormal phenomena, which she saw when she saw light so bright that, as she puts it, it shook her very soul. Hildegard, as I mentioned, was offered up by her parents to God as an oblate, which means just somebody dedicated to God. Basically, if you look in an Old Testament example of this would be Samuel, the book of Samuel, right away in the very beginning of the story. Hannah prays for a son, she gets him, and then says, I'll give him to God if you give me a son, and she has a son. So that would be kind of an example of an oblate. And so Hildegard becomes entrusted to an anchoress who was named Jutta, probably Jutta, of Sponheim. And that was at this Benedictine monastery of Mount St. Disibod. So for 30 years, it was just the two of them. As Hildegard was growing up, she was alone with Jutta for 30 years, right? And then Jutta dies, and Hildegard becomes the abbess of this monastery. Many other women come along in this period as well, and it becomes a legitimate monastery. More and more people added as the years go on. At age 43, her public life work begins, and she dies at 81. Now, in her life, she produced 6 major written works. She founded 2 flourishing monasteries. She wrote music. She gave birth, so to speak, to the earliest full-fledged morality play, and she became a correspondent and advisor to popes, kings, and emperors. And so she was a magnificent woman, so to speak. She did some very amazing things for a woman living in the beginning of the second millennium. Another superstar of this period is Innocent. Isn't that a great name? Innocent. Pope Innocent III, right? He never did anything wrong. I don't know. It just seems a really interesting thing. I don't know how they choose these names. Maybe you name yourself Innocent. But anyway, so Pope Innocent III was actually born Lothario of Segni in or around 1160. At a period of crisis in the Catholic Church, Pope Innocent III succeeded in affirming the power of his office against challenges from powerful lay rulers and from the Albigensian heresy, which the Albigensian heresy, or maybe it's Albigensian, either way, the heresy dealt with dualism. And dualism was a Gnostic belief system that kind of came from early 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. Not too different than the kind of things that were being combated in the first councils of the church, but this Albigensian heresy states that basically anything in the flesh or anything in natural, what we would call matter is evil, and spirit is good. Now, the reason this is a heresy is because Jesus came in the flesh. So, one of the views of the Gnostic beliefs was docetism, which basically said that Jesus was only a spirit and that he did not come in the flesh, because for him to have come in the flesh would have meant that his flesh was evil and he was evil, and how could God, who is good, whose spirit, who is holy, share the same place with matter, which is evil? So as you can see, this raises some issues, and so Pope Innocent III was really standing against this heresy at the time, and in so doing, he actually becomes one of the most powerful popes in the Middle Ages. In addition, through sweeping ecclesiastical reform, he attempted to mute the arguments of the critics of an increasingly venal, poorly educated, and self-indulgent clergy. Now, he's really known for one of his written works, which was sermon literature, called De Miseria Conditionis Humanae, which is Latin for On the Misery of the Human Condition. Now, Innocent's sermons were widely read, and on the misery of the human condition, it had 3 sections. One dealt with the miserable entrance upon the human condition, the second dealt with the guilty progress of the human condition, and the third dealt with the damnable exit from the human condition. They actually say that he was going to write a more cheerful work, but he never got around to it before he died. So it's kind of funny. I think he was going to write something about the dignity of man or the virtue of man, and he never quite got around to it. So he just sort of left us with this epic text of the misery of the human condition. Now, it seems dreadfully morbid to most modern readers, and rightly so, but it was remarkably popular in the centuries following his death. In fact, it survives in about 700 manuscripts. Now, what that means is, when something survives in a lot of manuscripts, it means that people saw it important enough to sit down and copy it and rewrite it and try to preserve it. Because if you don't preserve something, paper falls apart and it disappears and it dies. And so a lot of things that have been written over, in the history of humankind, we don't have anymore because people didn't preserve it. Which is interesting because the New Testament has the most manuscripts of any ancient text, which would say people thought it to be quite important enough to copy 5,000 plus manuscripts. Anyway, so, and this wasn't that long ago, but to have manuscripts close to the era of something was written, even for something 1,000 years ago, is pretty impressive, because it says a lot about the historical context. It says that people cared enough to make the effort to preserve it. So about 700 manuscripts survive, and it underwent more than 50 printed editions by 1700. The work reminded the reader of the inevitability of suffering and the inherent limitations of human life. It is clear, succinct, and full of pithy quotations from Scripture and other writers. It is also well seasoned with engaging wordplay. And the misery of the human condition was also radically egalitarian, because everyone suffers the human condition, rich and poor, master and serf. Everyone feels the assaults of lust, young and old, men and women, wise and foolish. His castigation of the vices of the rich and powerful, especially those he had observed in the papal court, must have also been pretty universal to people, because just about everyone was a victim of those vices seen in the papal corruption. And so there you have Innocent III, a superstar with a superstar work called De Miseria Conditionis Humanae. Another superstar from this period is Dante. In fact, probably the superstar of the period, with the superstar work of the period, which was his Divine Comedy. Now, the Divine Comedy isn't just a story, it's a poem, one of the biggest, most varied, and most accomplished poems in all the world. Appreciated on the level of its verse, the thing never stops getting steadily more beautiful as it goes on, as one scholar puts it. Believed was the pilgrimage of all humankind. The original title was simply Commedia, which was Italian for comedy, indicating that it is a story with a sad beginning but a happy ending. The adjective divinia, divine, was affixed about 2 centuries afterward, and so it wasn't originally called the Divine Comedy, it was just originally called the Comedy. But we attached divine, we as in humankind, some point about 200 years after Dante's work. The poem was divided into 3 parts. Inferno, which means, yes, you guessed it, hell. Purgatorio, of course, sounds a lot like it, right? Purgatory. And the third part was Paradiso, which is, of course, paradise. They're all united into a single paradigm, a journey of life. The Divine Comedy reveals that our soul's pilgrimage is a journey of attachment that moves from the lesser attachments of this world to the greater attachment to God. Dante himself was profoundly influenced by Aristotelian as well as Thomistic thought. And these are 2 names that we'll touch a little bit on this in a minute, but Aristotle was way back in the Greek period. We talked about that, several chapters ago. And Thomas Aquinas was, in fact, a contemporary thinker of the Middle Ages. I'm not sure about the exact dates and how they coincide with Dante's life, but Thomas Aquinas was a scholastic Middle Ages scholar, theologian, philosopher. Now, Dante quotes or refers to Aristotle's works more than any other body of writing in the comedy, with the exception of the Bible. The cosmos of the divine, this is pretty interesting, but the cosmos of the Divine Comedy is based on a simplified Aristotelian model. The earth is quiet at the center, surrounded by whirling spheres made of solid but transparent material, and nested one inside the other. The first 7 planetary spheres move from west to east independently. Slowest and closest to the earth is the sphere of the moon. Then comes Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. If you notice, the Sun's not in the middle, so this is not actually correct. This is not the heliocentric model, which is the true model, with the Sun as the center, and we revolve around the Sun. So the Aristotelian model was what Dante used. And of course, it was not real. And these were all, encasing these planetary spheres was the immense sphere of the fixed stars, and it has an almost imperceptible motion west to east of 1 degree in every 100 years, apparent in the precision of the equinoxes. Added to this Aristotelian cosmos is a starless 9th sphere, which imparts to all the inferior heavens and the simple daily impetus from east to west. This invisible first moved crystalline sphere is the boundary of space and the finite medieval universe. Yet beyond this outermost physical sphere is the spiritual universe that contains it, the mind of God, or the empyrean heaven, which is finite. And so there you have Dante's universe, his cosmology, as we would call it, the way he saw the cosmos, the order of the universe, the world, of course putting Earth at the center, which is not uncommon for that time period. I keep trying to think of the guy who, was it Copernicus? I think Copernicus comes with the heliocentric model, and he's deemed a heretic for thinking it. And then Galileo runs with it later. Anyway, so we'll probably address that at some point here in the next few chapters. Now, the Inquisition. Now, superstar events in history. We have to talk a little bit about the Inquisition. It was established in 1233, and it was a special court designed to stamp out heresy. But let's talk about the Inquisition a little bit, because I think there's kind of a mythological aspect to what we think of as the Inquisition. So we'll talk about what it is, and we'll talk a little bit about what it isn't. But the Inquisition was the sole tribunal concerned exclusively with religious heresy. And it first appeared in Languedoc during the early 13th century. It had 2 seats, basically, meaning it really existed in like a tangible form. One at Toulouse and one at Carcassonne, occurring shortly after the formation of the Order of Preachers by Saint Dominic, aka the Dominicans. Both institutions arose in response to the Albigensian crisis that we talked about, or Gentian, I don't know. I should have looked that up, right? And this crisis that was happening was resisted by also Pope Gregory IX from the beginning. And so this response to these heresies that were coming up, called for this thing called the Inquisition. Now, there were 2 bulls, and if you don't know what a papal bull is, it's just a formal proclamation by the Pope. I know it sounds like either some really mean people that you would call bulls, or maybe there was some animal called a bull, but a papal bull is just a formal proclamation by the Pope. And he had 2 of these in 1233. And these are often regarded as the initial formal constitutions of the Inquisitions in Languedoc, given to the Dominican friars as sort of their code of conduct in performing Inquisition. Now let me clarify, though. There really was no continuation of this elusive Inquisition, like centralized as one dominant force. The Inquisition was really any inquiry into any kind of heresy, and there was kind of a code of conduct that they would follow, a procedure, usually involved torture. So it really did happen. It wasn't a myth. And so the Dominicans, they also produced in this movement over the next few hundred years some aggressive texts that outlined the procedure of identifying, capturing, and prosecuting people they suspected of heresy. One of which is one text that they produce, which this comes a little bit later than what we're talking about now, and it's probably going to come up in the future chapters as well. But there was a text against witchcraft, which was called the Witch's Hammer. In Latin, it was the Malleus Maleficarum. And although there was no real, aggressive, single, unified, brutal force of the Catholic Church that was wreaking havoc all over Europe, burning witches at the stake, there were these pockets of Inquisition going around throughout Europe. And, if you want to read more about these myths surrounding the Inquisition, there is a text by scholar Edward Peters called The Myth of the Inquisition, and you can look that up. Now, granted, there were thousands killed. I mean, absolutely. And unfortunately, this inquiry into heresy meant that women were being burned at the stake for witchcraft or, boiled alive. I mean, all these things drowned publicly. And a lot of times they weren't witches, and we see an overflow of this in what happens in the Salem witch trials. But really that aggressive, what we call Inquisition, really gains its momentum about the 1500s and, late 1400s, because this same Inquisition thinking is what was behind the expulsion of the Jews and the Muslim Moors from Spain in 1492. And so, there were countless women accused of witchcraft, burned at the stake, and many Jews were killed because they were considered to be enemies of the church, enemies of Christ. The Jews were dubbed as Christ killers, and that anti-Semitism carried over for many, many years through the Middle Ages, even carrying over into the sentiment behind Hitler's theology that led to the extermination of 6 million Jews. So, the Inquisition was bad, and it was not a good thing, and it was quite shameful, I would say, a smear on Christendom, for sure. But what we see, I think, most, as we progress through the ages, is the necessity to have a pretty distinct separation of church and state. Whenever the government is the church and the church is the government, or one exclusively controls the other, it opens the door for a lot of corruption. So a lot of times people will bring this charge, though, against Christianity, and they'll want to say, well, what about the Inquisition? And the irony really is, though, if you are a Protestant, you would have likely been considered a heretic during the Inquisition. And so I always think that's interesting. So a lot of times I'll be in conversation with people, and they'll try to bring this charge against Christianity. What about the Inquisition? I say, well, yeah, it was a pretty awful thing, but the reality is, unless we were medieval, Middle Ages Catholics practicing and believing in that form of Catholicism at the time, we would be considered heretics beyond that. So, there you go. But on a lighter note, the medieval university is definitely worthy of some attention, because the medieval universities that were being developed at this time are actually the model for which the modern university is framed. And I think I've talked about this already, but again, if someone says, well, what has Christianity ever done for the world? I always think it's interesting. We could say, well, the university, the Inquisition and the university, right? So that's a joke. So with the rise of the university came the rise of scholasticism. And yes, that word sounds familiar to you because it probably is. So whenever you say scholastic achievement, clearly you're talking about school. Well, this was actually a mode of thinking, a school of philosophy that took place in the Middle Ages. Aristotle's authority was so great during the High and Late Middle Ages that he was known simply as the philosopher, or in the words of the poet Dante, the master of those who know. One of the great achievements of medieval scholasticism was the synthesis of Aristotelianism and Christianity by Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas lived from 1225 to 74. The medieval natural philosophers, however, were not slavish imitators of Aristotle, but frequently refined, modified, and even challenged his ideas. Their explicit and implicit criticism of Aristotle are part of the background to the scientific revolution. Also going on in this time period were philosophies dealing with nominalism and realism and a lot of really abstract kind of philosophical ideas that almost seem a little bit silly, but definitely part of the scholastic movement. While Aquinas was a great thinker in the scholastic period, Peter Abelard was likewise a powerful thinker in the scholastic movement. The book notes his encouragement of the right to question authority. He is also associated with a very significant theory of Christ's atonement called the moral influence theory of atonement. And Abelard believed that Christ's substitutionary death, as well as the Holy Spirit, uses this death as an example of God's love that shall arouse love in the hearts of people toward God. And but he did believe in the substitutionary atonement. And I know that doesn't seem like maybe a very big deal, but up until about the beginning of the second millennium, most theologians in the church adhered to what was known as the ransom theory, which was basically God used Jesus to get mankind out of the grip of Satan as kind of a ransom. Humankind was held captive by the devil. Jesus comes, and it's kind of a bait and switch. We'll give you Jesus in exchange for mankind. So then Jesus is given to the devil, but then at the last minute, Jesus says, tricked you, death and Hades cannot hold me down, and he resurrects. That was a pretty common belief up until about the year 1000 with Anselm of Canterbury, and then Abelard and some of these other moral influence theories of the atonement began to develop substitutionary atonement. And then we get into, in about 300 or 400 years from this period, with Calvin and Luther really refining these substitutionary views of the atonement. But Abelard also wrote one of the most intensely personal documents of the 12th century, which were his letters to his lover, Heloise. Abelard was first Heloise's teacher, then he becomes her husband, and later he becomes her spiritual director. And so Abelard had quite a significant contribution to this period as well, and he did promote this free-thinking, philosophical approach to theology and the world and the church and things that went on around him. And so as you can see, here are some superstars and superstar events of the Middle Ages, Christianity, the medieval mind, 1000 to 1300, Common Era.